Fire Emblem is a series that is very near and dear to my heart. It has everything you could ever want out of a video game series, from rich stories to complex tactical gameplay to hot anime characters. But one aspect that has always stood out to me is the mythology. Fire Emblem draws from a wide variety of myths and legends from around the world for inspiration. The place where this is most noticeable is the weapons available to use throughout the series. Some of them are based on mythical weapons, others on historical real-world weapons, and others still are simply named after characters from myth. In this video series, I will be exploring the origin of every single weapon from every game in the Fire Emblem series. Well, most of them, at least. I'll discuss all of the legendary and personal weapons along with a few other notable cases, while leaving out the more obvious generic weapons. I would hope I don't have to explain what, say, an iron sword is. I also won't be going over eponymous weapons, or weapons that are named directly after characters. While many characters' names do have their own fascinating history, there are so many of those that it would take several more videos to cover them all. Besides, it should be pretty obvious how weapons like Roy's Blade or Camilla's Axe got their names. Also, some of these names can get pretty complicated, so apologies in advance if I horribly butcher any pronunciations. With all of that being said, let's dive right in. This is the history and origin of every Fire Emblem weapon. What better place to start than at the very beginning? Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. And Mystery of the Emblem. And those games' remakes. Yeah, I figured it would be best in cases like these for me to group together games that take place in the same setting and share the same group of legendary weapons. Even with 4 games grouped together, there's not that many weapons to go over here, but that's to be expected from the earlier games in the series. We begin, of course, with the Falchion, the most iconic weapon of the Fire Emblem series that has taken multiple incarnations across multiple games, none of which are an actual falchion. The falchion was a real-life sword created first in France in the 13th century and used throughout Europe through the 16th century. However, it has a single-edged blade, contrary to Fire Emblem, where every version of the falchion has a double-edged blade. Starting off with a historical inaccuracy. This is going to be a fun one. And for our second weapon, we have our first instance of a potential mistranslation. The Japanese name of the weapon, Gradiusu, is more accurately translated as gladius, which is a Latin word for a sword that specifically refers to a type of sword used by ancient Roman foot soldiers. Why this name was given to a legendary lance is beyond me, but whatever. The English name is most likely based on Mars Gradivus, another name for the Roman god of war, Mars. The word Gradivus itself is based on the Latin word gradus, which means to walk, step, or march. The name Mercurius is actually the more accurate translation for the name of the ancient Roman messenger god, more commonly known as Mercury. Parthia was an ancient country located in modern-day Iran. The region was known for its highly skilled archers and their development of the Parthian shot tactic, where mounted archers would retreat from battle, only to turn around and fire their arrows back at any potential pursuers. Fun fact, this technique is also the origin of the modern English term parting shot. This is the first weapon we'll be discussing that was introduced in the remix, Hauteclair. The weapon is named after the sword Hauteclair, which was wielded by the character Olivier de Vienne in the 11th century French epic poem, The Song of Roland. The poem tells a story of Charlemagne and his soldiers, namely the story's protagonist, Roland, and their struggle to take back the Spanish city of Saragossa. Now, I want you to remember the Song of Roland, because it's going to come up later. A lot. Excalibur. The legendary blade of King Arthur, given to him by the Lady of the Lake, is arguably the most famous sword in history. And Fire Emblem gave the name to a legendary wind tome. Come on, guys, naming a sword Excalibur is like the free pass for a fantasy story. You had one job, Fire Emblem. One job. Imhulu means atrocious wind in Akkadian, an extinct language that was spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. Imhulu itself was one of the 7 divine winds used by the Mesopotamian sky god Marduk in order to slay the water goddess Tiamat. This weapon's name most likely refers to the spiritual concept of aura, a mystical energy field said to surround the human body. However, the name could also be in reference to Aura, a minor Greco-Roman goddess whose name translates to breeze. The English name Bolganon is just a corruption of the Japanese name for the weapon, Boluganon, which is perhaps better translated as Volganon or Volcanon, both of which are based on the English word volcano. Finally, a simple one. Thoron is named after the legendary Norse god of thunder Thor. This is our first weapon based on Norse mythology, and it won't be our last. Not by a long shot. Om is a word of prayer used in Hinduism and Buddhism, often spelled OHM in English. And that's it for the Arcanea games. Already you can see the wide range of mythical and historical inspirations used, and the references only get deeper from here. Now, let's move on to... The first weapon up to bat for Gaiden is... Wait, nothing's written here. Hey, where's the Gaiden weapons? What do you mean there aren't any? Yeah, much to my surprise, Fire Emblem Gaiden had even less in the way of legendary weapons than Shadow Dragon did. And those few that are present either have self-explanatory names or are reused from FE1. Fortunately, not all hope is lost, as the game's remake, Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia, added a whole smorgasbord of new weapons with their own inspirations. So fear not, Gaiden fans, you will have your day. Literally meaning two-handed, the Zweihander was a type of sword used in 16th century Germany. The sword was so large that it was used in a similar manner to a polearm and had to be carried over the shoulder rather than in a sheath. This is in contrast to its in-game appearance, where the Zweihander is wielded in one hand and is of a comparable size to the other swords in the game. On the other hand, the Ilwoon is very accurate to its real-life counterpart. The Ilwoon is based on a sword of the same name, used by the Bushong people of Central Africa. In addition to being used for combat, the sword was also used as a ceremonial object, for events like festivals or funerals. This one is a special case. The Seven Sword was one of a few items given away exclusively at Japanese 7-Eleven stores, hence the name of the weapon. Also known as Gudrun, Kriemhild was the sister of King Gunther and the wife of the hero Sigurd in the German epic poem Nibelungenlied. Rhomphaia isn't the name of any one specific weapon, but a small class of weapons from ancient Greece that consisted of a slightly curved blade attached to a pole. However, most times the pole was actually shorter than the blade itself, making the weapon resemble a sword more than a polearm. Referred to as a soliferum in Latin, the Sonnion was a javelin-type weapon made entirely of solid iron. The weapon was used by the ancient Iberian people, who resided in what is now modern-day Spain and Portugal. Nosferatu is an old Romanian word synonymous with vampire, which was popularized by the 1922 film, well, Nosferatu. The Japanese name of the spell is Resire, which is likely just a combination of the prefix re, a prefix used for most of Gaiden's white magic spells, and the English word desire. Nosferatu! The plural form of seraph, which is the highest rank of angels in Christian angelology. The Japanese name of the spell is, somewhat uncreatively, angel. The Latin word for arrows. This spell's name is possibly inspired by the Sagitta or Sagittarius constellations, which supposedly depict an arrow and an archer respectively. The Japanese name for the spell is just arrow. Man, they were really struggling with these old spell names, weren't they? Ragnarok is the foretold end of the world in Norse mythology, where all of the gods and humans would be slain, save for 2 humans who would go on to repopulate the race and start the cycle anew. Okay, another easy one. Medusa was a Gorgon, a monster from Greek mythology that had the appearance of a woman with living snakes for hair. Looking directly into Medusa's eyes could supposedly turn a person into stone. Lemegeton is another name for the Lesser Key of Solomon, a famous 17th century grimoire on demonology. It's actually a collection of 5 different books by separate authors, instructing the reader on how to do things like summon and control various demons. This is reflected in the spell's in-game effect, where it lets the caster summon up to 8 non-controllable terrors to fight for them. Alright, 2 games down already. We're making pretty good time here. Unfortunately, that's about to change, because next up is... Yeah, the Jugdrill duology of games was where intelligent systems really started to go ham with the weapon names. Not only are there a lot more of them, but... well, remember when I mentioned Norse mythology earlier? Tyrfing was a cursed sword from Norse mythology. It was made by these 2 dwarves named Dvalin and Durin, after they were essentially kidnapped by Svafarlami, the king of Gardariki, who forced them to make him a sword that would never miss, never rust, and cut through anything. The dwarves did so, but also cursed the sword so that whenever it was drawn, it would cause 3 great evils and eventually kill Svafarlami himself. Also known as Gram, the sword Balmung was wielded by the Norse hero Sigurd, and used to slay the mighty dragon Fafnir. Ironically, the sword cannot be used by the Fire Emblem character Sigurd, who is named after that very hero. You had one job, Fire Emblem! Gungnir was a spear wielded by the great god Odin in, you guessed it, Norse mythology. This one has some history behind it, actually. In the original English fan translation of Genealogy of the Holy War, the weapon was called Ichaival, which was supposedly a bow wielded by Odin, except this was completely made up. No such bow was ever mentioned in any historical documents or legends, meaning if you've ever heard anything about this bow, all of that actually stems from this fan translation. So, what's the actual mysterious origin behind the weapon's true name, Yew-Fell? A yew is a type of tree whose wood was commonly used to make bows. Yeah, that's it. Moving on. The term Valkyrie refers to warrior maidens who were lesser Norse deities. They were tasked with riding through battlefields and escorting any worthy fallen warriors to Valhalla, which is essentially Norse warrior heaven. This tome is named after the famous hammer wielded by the Norse god of thunder, Thor. Continuing the pattern of less creative Japanese names, Mjolnir's name in Japan is literally romanized as Thorhammer. The English name Valflame is a different pronunciation of the Japanese name of the weapon, Falaflame. Falaflame is named for Fala, or Fjalar, one of the 12 crusaders from Genealogy of the Holy War. Fjalar himself is named after one of 3 roosters, whose crowing will signal the beginning of Ragnarok. This sword is named for the slightly differently spelled Mistletoe, yet another famous sword from Norse mythology, which was notably used to kill the god Balder. Hey, something that's not Norse for a change! The Geibulg was a lance wielded by Cu Chulainn, a hero from Irish mythology. According to legend, the spear had the ability to explode in a spray of deadly barbs, like some sort of frag javelin. The Hel part of this weapon's name comes from the mythological Norse underworld, as well as the goddess who ruled over it, both of which were named Hel. Given that the weapon is an axe, it may also be based on an axe called Hel, that was wielded by the legendary Norwegian hero king Magnus the Good. The Japanese name of the weapon, Swanchika, has unknown etymological origins. Alright, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about weapons named after characters, but I feel like this is an exception. In-game, the tome Naga is named after the Fire Emblem series' recurring dragon goddess. Her name, in turn, is based on the Naga, a race of divine serpentine beings from Buddhist and Hindu mythology. Forseti was the ancient Norse god of justice and reconciliation. He was said to run a fair and honest court, and all who came before him would leave reconciled. I'm grouping these three together because they are all named after one of Loki's three children. Jormungandr is the world serpent, a massive sea snake that is said to surround the earth while grasping its own tail, similar to the Ouroboros. Hel is the previously mentioned ruler of the Norse underworld, and Fenrir is a monstrous wolf chained to the throne of Odin, who will be set free during the events of Ragnarok. In a fitting follow-up to the previous three, we have Loptus. Like Naga, the tome is named after one of Fire Emblem's draconic deities, whose name is derived from Loptir, another name for the infamous Norse trickster god Loki. The Bragi sword is yet another weapon named after one of Jugdral's 12 crusaders, who himself is named for the Norse god of poetry. A Volg is a type of large polearm used in medieval Europe. The Japanese name of the weapon is Puji, likely a corruption of Buji or Buj, a type of weapon from the Middle East that consists of a dagger-like blade attached to an axe-like hilt. As you can probably see, from this point on the games will tend to take most of their weapon names from a single mythos. It's a neat attempt at some cohesive theming, and this trend will continue with Before we begin proper with these games, I did want to talk briefly about the titular binding blade, or Sword of Seals in the Japanese version. While there's not much inspired about the actual name, like, it's a sword that seals things away, I did want to mention how the weapon clearly draws inspiration from King Arthur's Sword in the Stone, which may or may not be Excalibur depending on what legends you want to believe. Anywho, with that out of the way, yep, Binding Blade has the first instance of generic weapons having actual interesting names. The term Wodao is Chinese for Japanese sword, and specifically refers to a type of sword used in China during the Ming Dynasty, which were heavily based on Japanese sword craftsmanship. The Zanbato was a mythical variety of sword whose sheer size would apparently let it cut down both a horse and its rider at the same time. However, the theoretical size and weight of the sword would have made it nigh impossible to use in actual combat. Back to more significant weapons, and what better place to start than with the legendary Durandal. This blade is named after the sword wielded by Roland, a French paladin in service to Charlemagne, and the protagonist of The Song of Roland. Yeah, remember that from back in the Shadow Dragon section? Armads is a corruption of Almus, the name of the sword wielded by the Archbishop Turpin, a character in The Song of Roland. This is literally just the word blaze with the prefix 4 stuck on the front of it. Something of interest is the fact that the French name for the tome is éclair, not the pastry but the French word for lightning, which is odd considering that the spell is very clearly fire-based. Not to be confused with the part of the nipple, aureola is a term used in classical art referring to the golden light that radiates around the head of a holy figure. A good example of this can be seen in many depictions of Jesus Christ. The word itself is derived from the Latin aurea, meaning gold. Similar to Armads, Muligir is a corruption of a sword from the Song of Roland, this time being Murgle, the blade wielded by Roland's villainous stepfather Ganelon. Yet another weapon from the Song of Roland, Maltet was a spear wielded by the character Balagant. While the word has become synonymous in modern times with any world-ending disaster, the word apocalypse was specifically used in reference to the coming of the end of the world as foretold in the Christian Bible. Specifically, the events of the apocalypse are described in the Book of Revelation, which is where the tome derives its epithet, Elder Revelation, from. Fimbulvetur, or the Great Winter, is an event from Norse mythology that signals the beginning of Ragnarok, and consists of a winter that lasts 3 whole years. Literally meaning sharp sword in Old German, Ekisax was a sword wielded by the legendary Germanic hero Dietrich von Bern, as told in the old German epic poem Eckenlied. The Kati part of these swords' names is something that shows up a few more times with other Fire Emblem weapons, and is likely just a weird shortening of katana. The Mani and Sol parts of the names come from Mani, the Norse god of the moon, and Sol, the Norse goddess of the sun. Now then, we've still got quite a few weapons left to cover for this video, so I think it's time for a quick lightning round of weapons whose names are just words in other languages. Wolfbale is German for wolf axe, Rex Hosta is Latin for king spear, Basilikos is the ancient Greek word for royal, Rienfletch is a portmanteau of the French words rien and flèche, meaning nothing and arrow respectively, Luce is Latin for light, and Gespenst is German for ghost. Whew, that was a lot. But to leave this video on a slightly more interesting high note, Ereshkigal was the ancient Mesopotamian goddess of Kur, or the underworld. One of the more notable myths surrounding her describes how she came into conflict with her husband Nergal, for whom this tome's wielder is named. And that's the first 7 games done. Over 60 weapons and about 20 minutes later, and would you believe we're not even halfway through? Stay tuned for part 2 coming soon, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already so that you don't miss it. I'll see you all next time.